Welcome back to another episode of Detonation. Look, we got a little bit of a different type of episode today because we got Dave Lee, the China expert, back. I'm going to rock into a paragraph before we ask Dave how he is and how everything's going. I'm going to rock into this paragraph real quickly, then we're going to ask Dave a question, and then we're going to say, how you going, Dave? So the paragraph to set the theme of today's debate is, this is from Hugh White's new book, How to Defend Australia. Thank you, as you can see on the screen there. And it says, what matters is that China could still in a few hours inflict more damage and kill more Americans than we were killed in all of America's previous wars combined, which must affect America's decisions and make any president think twice when the chips are down. That is awesome. American policymakers' reluctance to acknowledge this reality is extraordinary, instructive, and unsettling. The most likely explanation for it is simply that no US leader wants to try convincing American voters that defending a US ally in Asia is worth risking a devastating nuclear strike on Los Angeles. And if they are not prepared to try to convince American voters of that, what chance would they have of convincing Chinese leaders? Dave, welcome to Detonation.
Thanks for having me back on.
This is a really important thing. If Sydney was nuked, I mean, is America going to rally to her cause? Are they going to come? Are they going to save us, or are they just going to leave us in the dumps?
Well, after reading Hugh White's new book, which was just released this year, it seems Hugh White, who has a PhD, he's a professor in strategic studies, he doesn't tend to believe that there would be a response.
No response from the United States? So we're not a valued partner then. But Dave, I put it to you that we've been there for every war and they've come to save us in the past.
Well, you see, they only really defended us because it was in their interest when Japan attacked them in Pearl Harbor, but they didn't help us out when it came to East Timor. But I guess after reading Hugh White's book and having a look at how, because I'm not an expert in military strategy, I know little to nothing about it. I've read this book and I didn't really know anything about Hugh White until this year. I've done a little bit of research on him, but I've had this theory for a very long time because I pieced together where the Chinese communities were, and I came up with this theory quite a long time ago, and I mentioned this to you as more of a conspiracy theory off camera once, and after reading Hugh Wright's book and seeing how he goes about, he talks about defending Australia and how battleships are kind of useless, they're just a target that carries a flag. He talks about air defense and sea defense and sea control and island control. He goes through all the basic studies. It's not like a paper, and it's just for public consumption. But I'd like to start this off by asking your audience, and hopefully there's people there watching right now. There are many people.
There's a huge audience there, so I think we'll get a lot of people if you want to ask them an audience.
If you guys are in the comments right now, I have a question for you. It's not whether you think Sydney could be nuked. I don't want to know whether you think that it could or could not, or China would nuke us or China would not nuke us. The question is, if Sydney was nuked, how would the international community respond? What do you think would happen? And if you have a look at the paragraph that Steele just read out from Hugh White's book, he makes it very clear that if America was to react, then they would risk being nuked themselves, and that would be losing Hollywood, losing LA, losing Seattle. California would be a target for Chinese nukes, and therefore it would be far too prohibitive for them to engage. And my theory is that China and their 700 submarines, because Hugh White, his defense strategy is island and sea and air defense, it makes it easier for us to defend than to attack. It would be so expensive for the Chinese to want to try and attack us. So it just doesn't make sense that they would do that. And the savvy nature of the Chinese, this would be a cheap way to meet an ends. And they have so many submarines. So my theory is that they could get a submarine off the coast of Australia and nuke the CBD of Sydney. Now, are you able to put up one of those photos that I sent you? The one where a 20 kiloton nuke hits Sydney CBD and it shows the radius.
I can get that. I can get that for you. I forgot to email that to myself.
Okay. Yeah. So there's I wish I had that.
Yeah. I can get
photos,
that for you. I can get that for you if you want a filibuster.
Would it take time?
No, I can do that right now. That's fine. We can fix this. Yeah, absolutely. So the audience, I'm just going to read you out some of the audiences while I grab those for you, because I do have a lot. You sent me a lot of those images, and they're fantastic images. So the anxious Aussie here, he says on a serious, he says the only thing is we are resource rich, but the US doesn't really need us. Or ours. It doesn't need our resources. So, there's no resource argument there. Johnny 431 says, it looks scary, anxious. Went to my disappointment last week. It's in the bush. I don't know what that means. Why not? All our major cities are on the coast and Canberra is the valley. So there's a few different people here saying, but no one really commenting apart from anxious Aussie, who's about this international community question, who's saying, that we are resource rich, but also is the United States, and therefore, it's not an imperative for them to race in and defend us.
Yeah, well, I guess China needs our resources. That's why they continue to buy a lot of our resources. Right now, we're going through a steel boom. We're selling so much iron ore right now, but because of the drop in the currency, it's not really helping our economy too much. But yeah, those images, I've got some images where I show the radiuses, and part of my theory here, if you guys will bear with us, part of my theory here is what I've done is I've mapped out where the Chinese communities around Sydney CBD are, and they are just outside of the radius of a 40 kiloton nuclear weapon. And if you look at the radius that goes around Sydney from Chatswood through to Strathfield, Burwood, you got Eastwood and Ryde up there, and it goes all the way through to Campsie, all the way through to Kensington. All of these Chinese enclaves or colonies, they have this arc, which is just outside the radius of a 40 kiloton nuke. Now, whether that's an accident or a coincidence, I tend to think that it probably isn't. And I refer to this other book here. If you guys watching at home while Steele gets that ready, this is the 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. I recommend you guys read this book. This guy gives you an overarching understanding on how the Chinese people think and how they're willing to wait and bide their time, and they have this 100-year plan to take over and become the largest.
That's a really good point, Dave, because I often talk about the Chinese strategy, and you talked about Muslims a couple of weeks ago. Concerning them, being a little bit of propaganda. And that's true, because if you actually look into Chinese geopolitical strategy, they basically have a strategy that in sort of Western thinking is when in Rome, do what the Romans do. And that's regardless of who they are. So that's the same in Taiwan, that's the same in Vietnam, that's the same here in Australia. So they behave as a mass. go about being productive citizens, but it's a long-term game as opposed to other minorities and other considerations such as Muslims.
And I've identified one suburb called Chatswood. It's just north of Sydney CBD. It's just outside the radius of a 40 kiloton nuke. And this suburb has been gaining more political power. It is the home of a very powerful politician, which I won't mention. There's been a simultaneously, while we've been building the rail network in Sydney CBD, there's been a metro that has been built which ends at Chatswood, which drives a lot of traffic to Chatswood. And it's part of the Chinese economic plan to, if you look at China as a country, you cannot have a large military and power unless you have a large economy to fund it. And that's part of the frustrating attitude of the Americans, is that they always end up with, we've got a large military. and my argument is your economy is on the decline and it's not getting any better, and you've got these greedy guys in the finance industry that are destroying your country. How are you going to fund this great military in the future when China is projected to have an economy twice the size of yours? And for you guys at home watching this, part of my overarching theory is that China will win the trade war, and I believe that they already have. We just haven't found out. We're going to find out in the future. That's just part of my theory. They've won the trade war, and am I still there? Oh, there we go.
You're here. I'm just trying to figure out how. I've got the images now. I'm just trying to figure out how to share them. That's all. Yep.
Okay.
They've won the trade war. Yep.
Yeah. So therefore, that is going to the concentration of economic might will end in a concentration of political power around the world. There we go. Now you guys can see what we're talking about. If you have a look at it, this is a 20 kiloton nuke. The inner radiuses would be totally destroyed, and you see the gray outer radius. That's where the radiation would hit. You could survive in that area, but these suburbs that have been underlined, these are Chinese suburbs. And you guys know the saying, there's no Chinese in Chinatown. So the theory that there's all these Chinese in Chinatown, it's not very valid. This is where the real suburbs are. And the one right at the top, that's Chatswood. Now, that city is huge. It is like a Hong Kong just off the top of Sydney CBD. It is enormous. I've got a few other images there, like the heat map.
I can bring that up.
Shows, the heat map shows Sydney and where the Asian suburbs are, but in fact they actually identify the Chinese suburbs. Oh, well, that's another one. So you get a better understanding of what would be taken out in if a 20 kiloton nuke was to hit Sydney CBD. A 40 kiloton nuke would reach Bondi Beach, so it would take out the entire city. This nuke here, this is the size of what landed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's around, I know Nagasaki was a little bit larger, but this is the size that we're talking about here. And if you have the image of the north that shows Chatswood, that would be very helpful.
Is that the one with the train line?
I guess you can go straight to the train line, and you guys can understand what I'm talking about here. Right at the top, there's Tullawong, and it goes all the way down to Chatswood. This has just been finished. Now, all of these suburbs north, there's Epping there. You see Epping. Epping links up with other Chinese suburbs off it, like Eastwood. It links up with a train line. So the whole, you can see how this is a plan to send a lot of foot traffic through to Chatswood. Chatswood is the largest suburb amongst all of those suburbs. It has a huge Westfield. It has sometimes on the weekends they have markets. It's where everybody goes to shop. So that's where, let's just say, all the people from Chatswood aren't going to Tullawong. Nobody goes to Tullawong. The people from Tullawong, they're getting on the metro and they're going to Chatswood and they're going to spend their money in Chatswood. And Chatswood is home of the headquarters of Huawei, which has been banned in America, yet we have their headquarters here. They're opening up stores, Huawei stores. It's home of Bank of China, which doesn't, the same as Huawei, doesn't hire any local people and is very racist towards the Australian people, and helps money laundering in Australia and getting CCP members into our country. Chatswood is, in my opinion, a serious threat to Australia's national security. I know it's an outrageous claim, but I believe in the future you guys will look back and go, well, this is the only guy that actually identified this. I believe also that this 100-year marathon is linked to Chatswood, Sydney, Australia. Now, if Sydney CBD was nuked, part of the plan, I don't think Chatswood is ready yet, but it is a huge city already, and they're building it up. And this train is a way of just sending more money there. Most of the companies and businesses are owned by Chinese. They do a lot of fraud. They tax avoidance. They have a competitive advantage. If you were to start up an Australian business in Chatswood, you would probably fail within a year or two, because you will probably try to pay tax and do the right thing. They will have a competitive advantage. They don't pay penalty rates on the weekend. You'll notice that their products and services will be cheaper than yours, yet they have more employees serving their customers, which is the best way to. I don't need to look at the books. You can, if you have more employees and your products are cheaper, you are cheating to get a competitive advantage. That's just how it is. This suburb is a huge parasite on the Australian people, and when you look at it, if the Australian government used our taxpayers' money to build this metro, to send foot traffic to Chatswood, to send more money and put it into the pockets of this Chinese Communist Party run colony in Chatswood, and then all of the money goes into the pockets of the Chinese Communist Party people there, and then they don't pay tax, this money is not going back into the government. It's literally a parasitic city on our just north of Sydney CBD. Not to mention, if you start up a business and you go and do the right thing and you close down because you cannot compete, your family suffers. So therefore, you don't have enough money to send your children to a good school or pay for them to go to university. And then the next generation suffers. You go through some sort of financial strife. You're more likely to have a divorce. It damages Australian families when people are not playing by the rules. And on the other side of the coin, you got the guy who's cheating and he's from China. He's able to put his children through a good school and pay for them to go to a good university and get a proper education. You can see how within one generation, we have people who are cheating and they're a parasite on our economy. And our government just built this metro, which is sending a lot of money to them. Now, I link that up. I know I'm talking about military and being nuked, but I put the social problems. All of these factors are very important. And I feel like I'm the only person in Australia looking at these things and seeing the dangers there. This is the heat map. Which Steele suggested to me. I didn't know about this, but it's called an Asian heat map, and it can identify where the Asian suburbs are. and you can kind of see that there's a loop around. It's like a radius around the CBD. There is a lot of Asians within Sydney CBD. If you go through Sydney CBD, I'm the only white person, but it doesn't. I believe it's just identifying the Chinese suburbs because there's a lot of Asians in Sydney CBD and it doesn't show up on the heat map. Is there another photo of the heat map that shows the radius? I think that's a bit more accurate. There you go. Now, just north, that one is Chatswood, and that's the one that I'm trying to show you guys
This
today.
one, yeah, here somewhere on here.
Yeah, the one directly above the Harbour Bridge.
Oh yeah, I see.
Now,
Oh yeah, way over here. I gotta go over there. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
yeah, little bit to your left. So for you guys at home, I'd like to ask you guys again: if Sydney CBD was nuked, I don't want you to debate the question if Sydney's going to be nuked. That's not the question. The question is, if Sydney CBD was nuked, what would the international community do? So my theory is that there's a possibility. Like, what I do is I think about it from a point of view of China. I think about it from what would I do if I was running the Chinese Communist Party, if I was Xi Jinping. This Chatswood is very suspicious in my opinion. 5 years ago, I moved there because I wanted to get a better understanding as to what's going on out there, and I lived there for 3 years. So you're not talking to someone who is talking from no experience. I also have run many experiments out there where I would go into shops and businesses and I would ask for a job and I would be highly qualified for many of the positions and I would record them. I've had to delete them all because you're not allowed to record people because of the surveillance acts. I was going to make videos about it. And then I would hire a Chinese national to go into the same business and tell them that they have no experience. And then they would get hired or they would be offered a job and harassed to come and work. Like they're desperate for workers out there. I've also run experiments with the real estate agents. There's also an insidious real estate agent out there that gives all the cheapest properties to Chinese nationals and actively discriminates against any other races. The banks out there are discriminatory. I have done a lot of work in this area before I publicly started exposing the suburb. And
so Chatswood's been on the Dave Lee radar for a while now, and
over 5 years, and only now I'm coming public with what, and I do get my facts straight before I say things publicly. And so far, I think if you have a look at my channel, I have a long history of being accurate. And this is not something that I've just put together like a conspiracy theory.
Johnny 431 says the West would get involved. Australia's full of resources, and that's what they want. Thank you, Johnny 431. So he's saying that the US, Canada, etc. would rally here because of our resources. Does no one care about history? I mean, what about the fact that we've always been there for them? Does that mean anything, or is it just about resources at the end of the day?
No, I don't think history is really important to what is happening today. It's like, I guess, a lot of Australians like their football. It's like going back to the 80s and saying that Fatty and Sterlo are still the best football players. Every year we have new competitors, and right now China's number one. And just because and there's teammates, there's often a lot of interest, and our interest is our trade going through the South China Sea. But there's a pattern here. Okay, so when China took the Senkaku Islands and started getting all aggressive around Japan, everybody thought that America would step up to the plate and do something about it, but Obama did nothing.
Yeah.
And then China saw weakness. Now, if I was to tell you guys back in, say, 2010 that China's going to get some boats that dredge sand off the sea floor, and they're going to build these artificial islands, and they're going to build islands on these reefs, and then they're going to put airstrips and militarize them and put missile launchers on there, you would say that I was totally insane. Now, when that happened, America did nothing. Their response was nothing. And they haven't done anything yet except for these FORNOPs, these freedom of navigation operations through the South China Sea. Nothing has changed. So their response has been so pitiful. I think it's more if a submarine was to get into off the coast of Sydney and launch a nuke into Sydney CBD, and then Xi Jinping was to come out publicly and say, China had nothing to do with nuking Australia, and we want to give our condolences to the Australian people, and we want to help out as much as we can. The international community would probably, they would think that it was China, but then they would think, hang on, and every day that goes past that no one does anything about it, the likelihood that China has literally just knocked off America's #1 ally in the region, or second, Japan's #1.
Somebody here said international community would let Australia burn. Laugh out loud. So that's kind of an interesting.
Who's that? Who's that person? Should get him on.
Real CTE, and then a whole bunch of people said yes, basically agreeing that Australia is on its own in this regard. It doesn't. There is no China choice. Hugh White's first book was The China Choice. That's the one I've read. I haven't got around to reading this one yet, but The China Choice. It's this balancing act, and it's this assumption that America will always come to our aid. But in an isolationist mode, America depends less and less and less on the world. I mean, it depends less on the world. It wants to go home. I mean, especially with 3D printing and its internal problems, its internal migration problems, and its domestic economy. It's trying to fuel its own domestic economy and stuff like that. It doesn't want China. It doesn't want Asia. It doesn't want Europe. It doesn't want the Middle East. It doesn't want to be the policeman of the world anymore. It would just let us go. And I mean, Trump, when he meets with ScoMo, he always ScoMo will ask him a question like, are you standing with us? And he'll say, we stand with all our allies. It's not a very special relationship, is it? It's just a very generic, we stand with you, but we also stand with Japan. And we don't know about Taiwan, and we don't really know about Vietnam either, but, you're in the same category. And it's like, we're supposed to be the most special country, even more special than Canada, and yet, what do we? We get left in the cold, right?
Well, our little quad and our little allegiances are just holding on. As I've said to you in a previous video, I believe that South Korea will eventually kick America out. And I know historically South Korea was built by the United States, and they pumped so much money in there, and a lot of Australian people and people in the West buy Samsung and buy their products, and I think that they're going to get kicked out. They're in a tough situation. So then we have Taiwan, which is, they're in a lot of trouble themselves. They're no use to anybody. The only country in Asia that we can trust, because interests are everything. What's your agenda? What's your interest? Japan's the only country that has the same interest as us. And
so would Japan rally if we got nuked?
Good question. 100% no. And in reverse, and that's what Hugh White says. I'm not an expert in strategic studies. Hugh White is, and I respect the professor who has spent 40 years of his life studying these things, and he said no. If Japan was attacked tomorrow, Australia would not get involved unless it affected our interests. So how do we expect Japan to get involved if Australia was nuked? And if it played out the way I just said, that would be, it's so expensive to launch a military campaign, especially against a country like Australia that is so far away. So you have to really affect them domestically. And that's why I focus not only domestically, the micro, but I also focus on the macro. And I combine the two, which not many people do. And then I grab not only an expert in strategic studies.
Larry here. I'll get right back to it, but this is a very interesting point from this Larry. Rude Dude or something his name is. A very interesting point. He'd said we'd just get branded nuke-phobic or radiophobic or something, but this is an interesting point. They might just quarantine us and say, oh well, all of the defense bilateral relationships are void. Their main city has gone down. They're basically defeated already. There's no point defending them. That's a very good point, Larry, over there on the comment section.
Well, yeah. Larry, 100%. That's exactly what I'm trying to get here. Is that if we get nuked, I know it seems like they're just the Opera House is not that important, or the Harbour Bridge isn't that important. But if they were to disappear, that would be such a hit to the identity of the Australian people. First, secondly, they'll take out the RBA, they'll take out the ASX, they'll take out our business hub. And third, we would be far too scared to get involved in anything that America would want us to get involved in the future. With one foul swoop, overnight, China could knock out America's number one or number second most important ally in Asia. And we would be one of those. See, the part of the plan is they have the first line of defense, which is Japan through to Taiwan all the way through to the Philippines. And there's a second line of defense, which includes Guam. But the final, Australia is that last foothold right at the end of Asia where America could launch back and take back Japan or help South Korea or get involved. But if they take us out and politically we just say, no, we don't want a piece of this anymore, our entire military is spending its time rebuilding.
We've got another great comment from Margot Huss. She says, the US won't stand with us because China already owns us. My 2 cents. So, this economic sort of colonization that's happened with Australia, with all the land and stuff. I mean, what is there to defend? I mean, if there's interesting debates that go on about ASIO versus the federal government, and and will are we even allowed to build a military base in Darwin if like I know there's troops up there, but are we allowed to expand that if America wants? And the answer is getting fuzzier. I mean, it's getting fuzzier, right? It's like we're getting pushed around by economic incentives. So that's a very good point from Margot, from Margot Huss.
Thank you, Margot. Very good. Margot, if you haven't read this already, this is a very important book. And this is where Professor Clive Hamilton, Silent Invasion, where he does talk about a lot of the political influence, and he touches on a little bit of the economic influence in Australia as well. I recommend Australians read those 2 books,
and
those 3 books.
And Clive put his whole body on the line, his career, his life, so on the line to, get that book out there, to get the real information out there. So you have to respect that fundamentally for him to write such a revealing book, right?
And I did meet him, and he's scared. He's actually scared. He when I first started talking to him and telling him how I know a lot of his research, he was a bit skeptical of me. He thought that I was out to get him at the first. I said, look, relax, we're on the same team here. Because there's so many spies and enemies within Australia. You see them all the time. They say it's not just politicians, but we've been subverted from within. But it's not too late. That's the thing. If the Australian politicians set up rules to protect the Australian people and actually did the right thing by the majority of people on this landmass and did it right now, we could turn this around real fast, because
there's no political will.
Well, that's part of the arrogance of the Australian people. They kind of do. The same people that will call someone who talks about China as a threat racist is, in fact, the real racist here, because they think that they are superior to Asian people. The reason why I fear the Asian people is because I respect their hard work and I see them as a threat. It's total opposite. Another part of the problem is that people, whenever America acts, they say Trump did this. But no, Trump is the leader of a democracy in one of the most divided countries on earth, where whenever China acts, they say China. No, Xi Jinping's the dictator. It should be Xi Jinping did this and America did that. It shouldn't be Trump did the tariffs and China did that. We have this. It's still in line with what the audience is talking about. Domestically, we have a problem here, and we can solve those problems. And a lot of people, they will call people like you and me talking about these topics right wing. And I'd like to make another point. We're not right wing. We're left wing. And I'll explain. So in America, in say China, if you're a Chinese man in China, and instead of calling yourself traditional, you call yourself a conservative, you call yourself traditional. You don't want any foreigners taking your jobs. You don't want any foreigners taking your women. You don't want any foreigners moving to China. You're right wing. You're a conservative in China. But as soon as you move to Australia, what is your incentive? To remain right wing? No. You become left wing when you arrive, because you want access to more of the goodies. Then you arrive and you say, oh, I want freedom for everybody. I want everybody to have a job. Oh, racism's really bad. But as soon as they go back home, they're like, we don't want any foreigners in here. So they're right wing back home, but as soon as they arrive in Australia, they're left wing. Now, I'm a minority in Sydney CBD. I want a fair go. Whenever you hear me talking, I'm constantly asking for a fair go, unless, ScoMo, change the national anthem to a fair go for Chinese nationals and no go for Australian people. I'm left wing because what I'm asking for is equality, and I'm not getting that. And that's really the crux of our domestic problems in Australia, is that the Australian people are being ignored.
So to stimulate the comments, because the comments I think the people have forgotten, but what we're asking, if you want to get a reply from us, please answer the following: if Sydney was nuked, would the international community respond? Would America then declare war? Would Washington declare war on Beijing? Would Japan come to our aid? Would the European Union stand up and say, the old colonial country, we must do something? Or would they just simply let us go and say, well, that was a nice country, but, we can't risk World War III over a tiddly-bit city like Sydney? If you have an opinion on that, write that in the comments. We really want to hear your opinion. We've read out a few of those already. Thank you very much. Sorry, Dave, what were you saying?
And keep in mind, most of the countries in Asia rely on China for their economy, and that's how America built their influence around the world. It's through their economy. And it doesn't seem like any country in Asia would be willing to risk their economy for human rights. Keep in mind, human rights is only there for the mighty and who the mighty protect. So Australia's only...
Wolfie Winks says, yes, the USA will and would if Sydney got nuked. Anxious Aussie says, no, there are not enough of us Aussies loyal to the West. Therefore, they won't rally. David Smith says the US would definitely get involved at this point, at the point of Sydney getting nuked. Thanks, David Smith, for that comment. Johnny431, who's being a very good commenter tonight, says the only war will change the direction of the future, back to nationalism. Oh, that's not an answer to the question, but anyway. David Smith says something here interesting. He says in 30 years, doubtful. So, David, can you expand on that for us? Because you're saying tomorrow they will, but in 30 years they might not be worth that. David, if you could expand on that, we'd love to hear that from you. But there's some interesting points there.
Yeah, it does make sense, because as China's economy grows, in 30 years' time, they're projected, if they keep growing at 6%. I want to make it clear that there's still a lot of people out there saying that China's got this massive debt problem. They have the middle income. They could have a middle income problem. I think. Whoop, did I cut out for a bit there?
You're back.
I'm back.
Right. You're all right. You didn't leave. You're all right.
Okay. I'll just like to make it clear that I truly believe that China's going to win this economically, and the people who disagree with that, they just say China has a lot of debt, and they ignore the fact that America has a lot of debt as well. They say that China has more exports, and therefore this mercantilist play that Trump with the tariffs and the trade war is going to work. No, my version of the Adam Smith invisible hand is that the invisible Chinese hand always gets its hand on the money, and that's what's happening in Australia, and that's what's happening in Chatswood right now. And we need to focus domestically on protecting ourselves before we become economic slaves ourselves, and they get their hands on our politicians for real. I'm going to be making a video on this topic very soon. It's not looking too good, but I'd like to know what you guys in the comments think. Keep in mind, if you want to say that America's going to get involved, you need to keep in mind that America will be risking California being nuked.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to think about the trade-off effects, the trade-off impacts. Margaret Huss actually sort of flipped the question on us for a little bit, but it's actually a really interesting thought experiment to think about Sydney. She says, what if we drop the nuke into Beijing? Who's going to rally to them? North Korea? Pakistan? Is it just China on its own? I mean, this is kind of an interesting thought experiment. Sydney is one thing, but
this is great. Now you get me to get all creative, and I love this question. I like the fact that people are getting involved in the comments too. Now, I've had this other theory as well, because really aircraft carriers and battleships are almost outdated now, because they're just floating targets.
The Second World War, battleships were dead in the water.
Yeah, so these days you need submarines, and you need a lot of them. And submarines these days can launch ballistic missiles. And part of my theory with South Korea is we know that the Americans are becoming more and more aggressive as this is an economic game, this trade with China, and they're losing. They can't compete with China in any sort of trade. And once they lose the tech advantage that they have at the moment, they're going to lose. So they need to try and take out the enemy in a way. And so part of my theory of South Korea, if South Korea was to kick the United States out, that would make, as John Mearsheimer said to Australia, if we kick America out, we become an enemy of the United States. Now, if South Korea kicks the United States out, they become an enemy of the United States. Now, what's to stop the United States getting a few submarines off the Korean Peninsula and launching a few missiles into North Korea or into Beijing, as your viewer just said, because they don't really care about South Korea anymore? Now, this is the position that South Korea is in. It's a very seriously dangerous position that South Korea is in. They're in a very dangerous situation, and I wouldn't put it past the United States. If they get kicked out of South Korea, they're like, okay, well, you're our enemy as well. We don't care what happens to you anymore. We might as well take a shot at Beijing.
Well, you bring up a very interesting point, because, this fundamentally speaks to the notion, who wants to be the great power player in Asia, and is it too expensive for America to even be involved anymore? I mean, it's been involved, and it's been the great dominant power since, I don't know, the Second World War, right? Is it becoming too expensive? Are the webs, the intertwining webs of power balancing, becoming too expensive to maintain? I mean, this is the idea. And to go to your thesis and to go to your hypothetical, if Sydney was nuked, I mean, this is the exact answer. I mean, this is the exact what you're trying to get at, the thought experiment, which is so beautiful, which is Sydney worth trading off for LA? And the answer is no.
The answer is no. The answer is no. Hollywood disappearing for Sydney CBD, and Seattle too. Hugh White mentions in his book, he identifies two cities that will disappear instantaneously, and that is Seattle and LA. I wouldn't put it past the Chinese, because I know how they think. I've read all these books all the way back to all the way back. They would be circumnavigating the United States with submarines as we speak, trying to see how close they can get undetected. There's many different games happening at once right now. And I'd also like to mention another book, because as soon as I pumped through this book, which was a big eye opener, Joseph Stiglitz, Joseph Stiglitz, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics. Recently, this year, he just released a book. The title, anyway, I'm halfway through the book, and he does mention a lot of the things that I'm talking about with you guys today, about how tough it is for America to take on China economically. And so a lot of my theories, they're not just batshit me making things up. It's I pump through a lot of books trying to get to the bottom of these problems. And Joseph Stiglitz is the only person, and that's probably why you don't see him on mainstream media in the United States. He's the only person that did kind of hint that America can't get out of this in his book. I'm only halfway through it. I haven't finished the book. Maybe he has some suggestions at the end, like every good academic. But he's it's not looking good for America's economy if they go toe to toe, and that's why they want to just take out China as and decouple. Because they realize that they just can't compete. This country's better at that game. You're boxing someone who's beating you up. You need to decouple and stop playing. That's what's really going on here.
Going to the power ratios. I mean, there's hard power and soft power. I mean, defending Hollywood is a huge soft power a trade-off for the CBD. So you mentioned Hollywood, right? And the reason you mentioned Hollywood is because Hollywood has global influence. I mean, empires are built in the mind, and that's a huge global influence that you would allow to be knocked out. California is a tech influence. I mean, you lose the rest of the global tech, your tech hegemony. That's not worth it. America already has vast gold, diamond, iron ore, coal, copper, wood, timber, rare minerals, a whole bunch of them that Australia can provide. Australia doesn't sell that much to the United States in that context anyway. It sells it more to China in a lot of ways, not all of it. But actually, if you even look at like if you go to if you go to the ASX and you just go down a random mineral company, all right, you just pick any random one out. You come to the front page and it's like, I am XYZ or ABC Mineral Company, and we do this, and it'll have a picture of a bunch of white people on the front, and they're panning stuff, and there's big machines and stuff. Go straight to the directors, bang, it's all Chinese. It's always like that. And so, and that's just how it's been for a long time now. And people don't get that the front image is white people on the front of the surface, but actually the directors and all the trade back end admin and everything, it's all Chinese, because that's who we do business with. That's who you're voting for, people. Whether you like that or not, that's what's going on. We have more people commenting about the question that's tonight. That we're asking the people in the comments, and we're saying, if you want to comment, please do. We're reading out your comments, and it's, if Sydney CBD gets nuked, is anybody coming to coming to save us? Is the United States coming to save us? Is Japan coming to save us? Is South Korea going to rally? Is Russia going to rally? Is India going to rally? India's an interesting one. Is Vietnam or any of those Southeast Asian nations? Is anybody going to stand up for us and say, hey, it's worth our time going to war with China?
It is based around the economy. That's where it comes from. People tend to talk about the military, but you cannot have a military if you don't have an economy. So I focus on the economy first, and then look at the political will behind the country. And when I look at China, their ultimate goal is to kick the United States out of Asia so that they can double their
the Monroe
GDP.
Doctrine, right?
Yeah, I guess that's America's version of it. They don't really have one just yet. They've been, hiding and biding their time, but eventually they will let us know. But that's clearly their plan. Taking the Senkaku Islands and letting Taiwan know that they're next, and the South China Sea. The thing is, there's not been any response from the United States at all. Now, the South China Sea was a big problem for every country in Asia, and it was a big eye-opener to all of us. Now, keep in mind, there's no such thing as human rights, and if you get nuked, don't think that God or any sort of magic's going to come and save you. I personally, I just believe in reality in this situation. If we were to be nuked, what would be the response? Do the people in the comments think? I tend to believe there would be a long month of condolences. China would probably then say, look, we can send troops down there to help you out. We'll probably give you a loan and
so the old-fashioned salami tactics back from the Cold War. Remember the salami tactics?
There was Hugh White mentions the Cold War, and he mentions the Soviet Union. The thing is,
it's the Berlin Wall.
Yeah, the Hugh White mentions it. I'm not an expert on it, but he did mention this, and he says in his book that the Soviet Union were certain that if they did anything wrong, if they attacked their neighbors, United States would send nukes into the Soviet Union. Now, that is not the case today. China has been calling the United States bluff, and it's slowly getting worse. The ultimate goal would be to knock a country like Australia out of the alliance. And then there would only be a matter of time until America has been pushed out of Asia totally. Now we did in Nauru. Mike Pence came down and helped us set up a naval base in Nauru, or Manus Island. It was Manus Island off the coast of Papua New Guinea. And now I understand why, after reading Hugh White's book. Part of the plan is island control and sea defense. So that if you're looking at that from a Chinese standpoint, there's almost no, it's far too prohibitive. It would cost way too much money to try and cause any trouble in what do they call it, a conventional war against Australia. Doesn't matter how expensive or valuable our resources are. So part of this, what we're seeing here, the pattern is there's a possibility that the United States will ask us to stop selling any valuable commodities to China in the near future. Say, look, as John Mearsheimer said, stop feeding the beast, cut them off. And what does that mean? What's China's response going to be to that? Well, nuking is an insanely, it's a conspiracy theory. I'm just going to admit it. But when I piece together the heat map and where the Chinese enclaves are and the Chinese colony in Chatswood, it does look like there is a long-term plan going on in Sydney CBD, and our politicians are complicit in this. But then what will happen is, I've mentioned this last year in videos before about piracy. One of our most important interests, when we dig holes and we put coal on boats and we send them through the South China Sea, we want to make sure that our trade is safe. And if some of these ships start disappearing through piracy and nobody takes responsibility for them, it's going to be so expensive to follow our ships with, say, a battle, some sort of protect them somehow with some sort of military. It would almost defeat the purpose of trading in the first place, and that will destroy our economy.
Anxious Aussie here. Anxious Aussie brings up something interesting, and he says they could use biological warfare, take out the majority with disease. So,
there's too many Chinese here. No.
Is that a thing?
No, 100% no, because they would risk infecting the Chinese Communist Party members in Sydney. We're flooded with actual Chinese Communist Party members that are doing the deeds of the Chinese Communist Party here. And that, I guess, unless they know about it, but I believe if say something outrageous. See, in 1997, when the Hong Kong people left Hong Kong because they feared the Chinese Communist Party, 4,000 people immigrated to Chatswood. And now we're starting to see that probably wasn't an accident. It was a targeted location, which is outside of the radius of a 40-kiloton nuke on Sydney CBD. And keep in mind that back then, China, out of their wildest dreams, could probably not have imagined that they would be this successful. And so their game plan would evolve day by day, month by month, week, year by year. And they would have been sending more and more people to places like Chatswood. And if they were to, say, be blockaded or something out of left field would have happened to China, this would have been a way to knock Australia out of, stopping Australia in its tracks and knocking us out of, stopping us from helping the United States.
So, Dave, I ask you like this, and I ask you politely.
Yeah.
Are you a China alarmist, as the same as people were Japan alarmists in the mid 1980s when Japan was going to take over the world and was buying up all the land and What's the difference between Japan's rise, its meteoric rise, where they had people in Washington throwing down Japanese products and saying, "Stomp these, destroy these." What's the difference between Japan and China? Why is China different?
Oh, it's a huge difference.
And
China
is Chatswood
is
the key?
Chatswood is a very, very, very big. It's a very powerful key to what is going on right now. Japan never had a military, and
Article 9.
this is the difference between economic might and political might. Power is everything. Power is everything, and the United States has always controlled Japan since World War II, of course. And so, therefore, it doesn't matter how economically powerful or how rich Japan became, they were always going to be controlled by the United States. And they were never going to be a strategic competitor to the United States. So all of these fools who are running around worried about Japanese, if you've met the Japanese and you understand their mindset, no.
They're an economic colony. They were built as an economic colony that just got a little bit out of control and people overreacted. I totally agree with you on that.
Absolutely ridiculous ideas, hey, that people thought that Japan was ever going to be a threat. China is building a military. China is
an
building
old civilization, a very old, very strong, very powerful civilization that has almost always broken out into a sort of Mongolian frenzy, but it just never could quite get there. It always sort of self-destructs. But with technology, the China's credit system and new technologies, they might have domestic control, which enables them to spread further and colonize the whole of Asia, right?
Well, China does control most of Asia already. If you look at our neighbor to the north, Indonesia, it's controlled by, 1% Han Chinese Indonesians. They control the wealth in that country. And there's such a small population. That's why I wanted to have a look at Jakarta. And by the way, this month they announced that they're going to move the capital from Jakarta to Borneo because it's on the water level, but the Han Chinese in that country control it, and they even though the Han Chinese that live in Jakarta and they control all of the wealth, they've never been in China. They can't speak the language. They can't even remember where their great-great-grandparents came from in China. They identify as Chinese.
It's like this Carrie Lam business, where she had the leaked email, the leaked soundbite, where she famously said, "I'm serving two masters. I'm serving the Hong Kong people through the Constitution, and I'm serving Beijing." And that just sounds like the common call of all of these leaders all over Southeast Asia. They're all serving two masters, except for maybe Taiwan, except for Japan, and if you want to stop it, except for here, and definitely not India.
The difference between Hong Kong and Australia is that the Hong Kong Island and Hong Kong, it's such a small area and it's so heavily populated, so it's hard to disperse them. It's hard to disperse the protesters and control those people in such a small area. Australian people can be controlled. So if our government is taken over and they start telling our police to go lock up people and doing things that breach on our human rights in a serious way, they can just block off streets and we would not be able to amass a large enough protest to fight back against the Australian government. And that's what I fear the most, is that as the CCP members within Australia become more and more powerful and they control our politicians, there's a possibility that our police will start locking up white people, because effectively that's partly what is going on here, is that we are slowly losing our power and our freedoms.
Do you see much Chinese influence in Washington itself, in Washington D.C., that would impact this scenario, building off this scenario. So do you see an infiltration where it would impact Trump? And Trump would say, well, they nuked the Sydney CBD, but I can't do anything because I'm beholden to some sort of
No,
organization in Washington.
no.
There's
I
not enough
recently
influence?
No, when you're in America, you're an American. They train their immigrants properly. We don't. We don't set the rules here. Immigrants come to Australia and tell us, "Oh, well, our culture is superior to yours," and we're like, "Oh, yeah, you are superior to us. Would you like a job and some welfare and some Medicare? Oh, welcome to our country. You can also vote against the local people as well." That's what we do here. In America, the people that arrive, they instantaneously put on a New York and Yankees cap, and they put a American flag around them, and they go, "I'm American now," because they fear being seen as an enemy within the country. I recently spoke to a Chinese guy of Chinese descent who was born in Sydney, and he has a large business in New York. He comes back here, has a strong New Yorker accent, and we had a little bit of a chat. And he felt the need to let me know that, oh, I was born here and I'm Aussie. And he had this almost, I wasn't letting him know that I felt that he was not Australian, but he felt that he had to prove to me that he was Australian. And that mentality didn't come from here. That came from New York. That came from America. Because if you're not American, you need to prove that you are American. But in Australia, we don't set the rules. We don't tell people. See, that's the thing. If you come from, say, Jakarta, which I was shocked to see the poverty and the way that those people live. If you come from that type of environment, and we give you a lot of freebies, are you genuinely do you genuinely appreciate it, or do you take the freebies and think about what more you can take? I tend to believe that they don't appreciate the goodies, and they think, oh, these people are easily manipulated and I can get more freebies out of them. And that's what the Chinese people are doing to us as well. They come from the most competitive country on earth, where people will actually create fake eggs out of plastic and sell them, and their customers will die, and they'll take the profits and run to another part of China. This is a competitive dog-eat-dog country, and they come down here where we're soft and we're afraid to say things in our national interests, and domestically we're slowly dying. That's why I'm speaking out.
Dr. Dan Elton, he's a regular on this show, and he's come on quite a few times. He's a very good guy in the medical industry, big on the medical AI. Lovely to see you in the comments there. He's from America, and he has an American's perspective on this. And he said, the big problem I see right in the U.S. right now is the Chinese stealing IP from government and industry. This is the the big IP, big data theft that Trump's going on about. A lot of what I've been saying on this show is, yes, Trump tariffs are a little bit to do with money. I mean, $300 billion. I mean, whatever. But really, it's coming down to stop stealing our technology and stop undermining our tech industry and our tech advantage. And I agree with you, Dr. Dan Elton, on that one. And thank you for being in the comments. You're a very valued person, and I hope to see you again on the show very soon. And I'll see you at the debate as well, Doctor. But yeah, what do you think about that? That's a big one in the US. That's what they talk about. I mean, down here we've got a completely different scenario, but up there it's tariffs, it's trade wars, and it's IP theft.
Yeah, they're stealing technology. Everyone knows about that. It's in the mainstream media. Yeah, it's very. China is still a developing country in most of that country. There's 1.4 to. They don't even know how many people are in the country. There could be 1.7 undocumented people in China. I went to the most heavily populated part of China, which is in Guangzhou, just to check it out, just to see if I could walk around in the most heavily populated place in the world. Yeah, that's the problem that America is dealing with, is that their finance industry sold out their future for short-term profits, and now America is starting to see the negative effects of that. But I would like to bring up that the UK was the global hegemon at one stage. And what they did was they used this barbarian nation called America as their source of cheap labor. And these Americans had their own economic slaves, which were actual black slaves. Now, America spent their time hiding and biding and taking their technology. Now, they had a landmass 3 times the size of the UK and a population 3 times the size. How did that go for the British people? Well, the United
Not very
States,
well.
as the economic powerhouse, and then Britain was still a little bit arrogant, and they got themselves in they started talking tough a little bit too much. They got themselves in a few wars, and that was kind of the end of them. But luckily, they had the United States still to look after them at that stage. During World War II, they had a rotation of generals, and because the United States, most people didn't even want to defend the UK because they had so much trouble with them at that point. Now we look at the United States, who decided and didn't learn from history. Like this is part of the problem, is that the next generation doesn't learn, and we don't live long enough as human beings. Like 60, 70, 80 years is not long enough. And people running the country at 60 years old, they're arguably still children. When you look at and they're not necessarily wise enough to look at history and make sure that they do the right thing. But as it was Dr. What was his name? Dr.
Yeah, Dr. Dan Elton. He also added something, but I'll let you go on and I'll tell you what he said.
I'm still trying to get to your point, sir. Then the Americans, they decided to use China as their factory, and China did the exact same thing. So that's the progression here. China has a population 3 or 4 times the size. And so you can naturally see how this is going. We have a historical, it has happened in the past, so there's no reason why China shouldn't end up overtaking the United States, and they probably would not be stopped either.
Hypothetical. Oh, I'll just tell you what Dr. Dan said. He says, yes, we still have several Chinese postdocs and scientists at NIH, which is probably I think some sort of medical university or lab or something, and several have stayed for a few years and left for Ping An Technology, a Chinese company. So Ping An Technology, so it's some technology company. But he says on the plus side, a lot of Chinese students and postdoctorates who come to the US stay and contribute to the US R&D. So the Chinese suffer a brain drain. Talking about data theft. So they come in, they add to it, and then China steals it back. So that's what he says. That's kind of interesting. What do you think? Because I think it's like something like 500,000 Chinese students in the United States right now, right?
At the moment, there are a lot of postdocs and scientists that are going back to China because their economy is starting to mature, and they're starting to have more opportunities back home where in the past they didn't. So they were forced, if they were as you get to PhD level, you're it's not generalized. You're in a more specific niche, and if that niche does not exist in China, it becomes almost impossible for you to work back there unless you want to take a pay cut. And so therefore you you don't get a PhD unless you want to narrow down on a specific. And those opportunities have historically been in the United States or back in the UK. But now more opportunities are starting to arise within China, and so the brain drain is starting to go the other way around now. Now, my contacts in science are telling me that they are getting headhunted right now. For instance, Oxford University, they are receiving. So just say they go to conferences around the world to give talks and tell people within their niche what they're doing in science, what they're working on. Chinese nationals are coming up to them and offering them positions back in China. And so this has not been reported, and the mainstream media probably wouldn't want to touch on this, but I know for a fact there are massive businesses being founded right now in China, and they are out hunting the best in the West, and they're considering it. And some are actually disappearing out of some of our best labs. And if you go to some of our best labs, I know Oxford University is still number one, but these labs are outdated. They really are. They're outdated, and they're not keeping up. And so these scientists are going to places in China, and they're looking at their labs and they're thinking, wow, look at the facilities here. It's far more sophisticated than anything we have back in Oxford. I might take it. They're able to offer them more money too, because the wages in Oxford and other labs around the world, and also we have a problem with gangsters in the science community. We have these postdocs that are working 12-hour days, and they're doing their best just to pump out one first authorship per 2 or 3 years, and a lot of their hard work is being stolen from them, and it's very competitive in the West. And so China's offering these high wages up front, and they have superior. They're investing in science, and the opportunities are over there right now. And people are going to hate to hear this, but it's a fact, and it's what's happening now. This is not a theory. This is what's happening right now. What did he say?
We're planning to have Dr. Ben Goertzel come on. He's a multi-gazillionaire, one of those guys. He works in AI. He's an incredibly cool dude, but he's gone to China. He's taking his whole company there, and he said the reason is because the United States is too conservative, too anti-science, too too radical in that way, and he can conduct business a lot easier with a lot less restrictions in China. Now, I don't know. That was 2013 that he made the move. It's now 2019. A lot has changed in that time. But I'll ask him when he comes on the show. I'd actually be very interested to bring you on when he comes on on that show, because he has a huge AI company over there. Dan Elton says, yes, but foreign graduates pay higher tuition than citizens at state schools, so it's good for our economy. My concern is specifically about PhD students and postdocs, because he said PhD students, they're paid working teacher assistants, which they suck at because of the poor English, and research assistants. But basically, he says after the U.S. taxpayers trained all these people, they get enticed back to China by subsidies. So America's subsidizing Chinese innovation in a way.
It depends on where they come from. So, for instance, in Sydney, we have a lot of labs that have a lot of Asian PhD students, and you can identify the dummies real early, and they end up just going back to their hometown. Say, for instance, if it's in Thailand or in Indonesia or some of those smaller economies, and they'll take a extremely high position and get a lot of status back there, but they won't get an offer in a competitive lab in America. America is extremely competitive. It is tough over there. But yeah, this the guy you were just talking about is 100% right. They waste days doing training on things that are just about safety and animal rights, and like animal welfare things, and all of these things that you don't have to deal with in China. Last year, I think it was last year, there was the guy that used CRISPR to try and eradicate AIDS in a few twins, and he's disappeared. By the way, the guy's disappeared because there was such a controversy in the science community, and then scientists were going nuts in the West. But there's a lot of underground Frankenstein-style science going on in China. And it might sound bad, but in fact, that's where a lot of the innovation is going to come from, the people who are willing to take extreme risks. And there's so many opportunities for that. So unfortunately, there's a race to the bottom now. If the West keeps being so careful and not willing to take those huge risks, the most advanced, newest breakthroughs are going to come out of China because there's less regulation. But yeah, what do they say?
So there's a bunch of different comments. I think some people are saying here, what can we do? Others are saying, all sorts of things. But yeah, one says, how can we raise, Ash David says, how can we raise awareness quickly without being called crazy? Or Ray, as he says it. How can we raise it? I mean, chats like this, hypotheticals like you've suggested, what if Sydney was nuked, are extremely good thought experiments. Reading books, you've got a whole bunch of books there. Hugh White's books are incredibly important. Becoming a bit of a realist, reading some Mearsheimer would not go amiss. Knowing how the gangster economies and the gangster hard realist, politics works between countries. So all of this sort of stuff really does start to help. But how do we raise awareness, Dave Lee, about things, including things like Chatswood, which is so fundamental and so important to, unlocking the global game?
Well, I've had this problem for a long time. I've had this problem where I would like to get extremely complex on this problem and explain everything and go deep on this problem. But that's not how the world works. I've noticed that out in the public sphere, you have to become very specific and identify one specific problem. And I've identified the Chinese Communist Party. And when I look around, I realize that if you just go out and you just focus on one thing, building awareness around the Chinese Communist Party, and then let the public run with it, that's the only way that we can protect the West.
You can learn a lot. You can learn a lot by going to Fong protests. These guys, there's a lot of them. There's a lot of protests. It impact the Chinese Party, through political plays to put different people in power, persecuted millions and millions and millions of people in that religion.
Yeah.
So they know all the stuff, and they're everywhere handing out documents saying this is how bad they are.
Yeah, the Falun Gong and Falun Dafa, and the question the viewer asked was, how can we fight back? And how we can fight back is by keeping the message as simple as possible. And by keeping the message as simple as possible, we focus on one thing, the Chinese Communist Party. And that's something everybody can get behind. Falun Gong, Falun Dafa, Tibetans, Taiwan, the Hong Kong people, the millions of people in Xinjiang that are
Uyghurs,
being persecuted, the Mongolians, the Japanese, the South Koreans. Everybody can get behind one simple message. The problem with some people's messages is it becomes too complex, and I can sit down for hours, as you know, and go deep on all of these topics. But at the end of it, what do you take from that? You need to take one message. The Chinese Communist Party is the threat. That's the one message,
David.
And then everything else comes from it.
Dave, I need to ask you, because you keep skirting around this one. India, hypothetically, we get bombed. India, what do you think happens with India?
Modi is looking very friendly with Putin at the moment, and they're looking for ways to avoid the US dollar. So the reason why we don't know what India is doing is because, and they haven't committed to us, is because they're playing the game.
India's always been friendly with Russia, though. Going right back to the 60s, it was a natural ally after the sort of peaceful revolution, right? After Gandhi's revolution. So that's not really breaking news, is it?
Oh, well, it is. It was yesterday and the day before. I don't know if it's in the Western media, but I'm watching Chinese media. So in Chinese media, they're reporting on Modi and Putin meeting up and having serious trade discussions. We all know about Pakistan.
Is Russia becoming a Chinese proxy? I guess that's the big question. Are the Financial Times? Oh no. Yeah, the Financial Times or something is saying that. Is Russia becoming a colony of China?
There are a lot of Chinese in Russia, but yeah, Russia and China. Xi Jinping last year or the year before gave Putin an award of friendship, best friends, like a BFFs style award. Russia and China are very close allies. But the question that you asked was about India.
Yeah.
And if you have a look at it from India's point of view, India is becoming far more aggressive in Kashmir at the moment because a lot of the water that flows into Pakistan comes from Kashmir. Now, India is starting to get a little bit heated because a lot more money is flowing into Pakistan because all of the oil from the Middle East goes through the Belt and Road Initiative through Pakistan. India's kind of being left out because it seems like they've chosen the wrong team. America's not really helping them out. So they've signed this trade deal, and you got Modi and Putin shaking hands and having long meetings this week. This is breaking news. And people are talking about how these two countries are looking for ways around the US dollar because they don't trust it and they don't want to deal with sanctions. What does that mean? Well, it means that they're looking to build BRICS.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You can think about it in the context of BRICS, and that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't really mean the only country in the world that can hurt China is India because they have the population to do it, but it doesn't seem like they're...
But the Himalayas are too big, man.
It's in India's best interest to just sit back, let this economy mature, get rich, sign trade deals. It's not in their best interest to get involved in geopolitics at all. They want to just be friends with everybody. They're not exactly good friends with Pakistan, and it's heating up at the moment.
You know why you're right? You know how you know you're right? Because they let Sri Lanka fall to the Chinese debt trap. If they were a confident country, Sri Lanka would be their colony, not some sort of Belt and Road Initiative slice of China. I mean, Sri Lanka actually sort of benefits for that because, right now we've got this sort of demographic bubble. China's a very capital rich. It's trying to flow all that capital out. With the Belt and Road, it's kind of interesting. They'll pay off a lot of people, but when the cash runs out, a lot of those countries, Pakistan included, especially way out as far as Europe, those guys are not going to continue to be friends with them when the money runs out, especially in Africa, way over there. But India is not a confident country in that way. BRICS is shows that it's not a confident country. The fact that It can't control, its aircraft carrier is useless. It doesn't have a military. It can't even take care of Pakistan. It's not a confident country. And I agree with you. And so why would they get involved with an Australian issue?
No, that was a question from one of the viewers, wasn't it?
No, that was me.
Yeah.
I was asking about
Oh.
India because we hadn't talked about India.
Yeah, I haven't. I feel like they're unless Kashmir and Pakistan heats up, which I don't think it will because it's not in any of their interests at the moment. They've been poor for such a long time. It's in their interest to just sit back and trade and fix up their awful economies and try to provide a better standard of living for their people. Whereas on the other side, we have a high standard of living and we're on the decline. So we're trying to fight for our status and our position in the world, and it's slowly getting taken from us.
Well, what you're trying to do is you're trying to tell people to start fighting. So you're trying to wake up and start fighting. Because, we are fighting, but only on a subconscious level. And they haven't actually, people aren't actively fighting yet.
I was asked this question by a Chinese national today. If Xi Jinping was assassinated today, what do I think would happen? And I believe that they would internalize and they would have these internal fights over who would rule China, and it would be the best thing for the West. And then it gets back to the rest of us just focusing on one thing, and it's something that even the Chinese people within China that hate the CCP can get on board, is that the enemy to the world is the Chinese Communist Party, and everybody can get behind this. And if they don't, we're going...
That we hear loud and clear, and thanks for coming on Detonation. The enemy of the world is the CCP. It's 3 little letters. It's not that hard to remember. One of them's one of the letters is very close to the beginning of the alphabet. So if you're just learning English, it's A, B, C. That the other one is P. It's further down the alphabet, but so it's the CCP, and they're the enemy of the world. And actually, they're not that big. It's a room. It's a Congress room. It's not that big, but it has a lot of undue influence. And the world has been under Pax Americana, which is sort of a long prolonged peace. A lot of people talk about all the violence and all this sort of stuff. It's not particularly true. It's because you read about it. There's less wars nowadays. There's less violence overall. It's actually all getting better in a way. Take Pax Americana away, realpolitik, this guy's head will actually come out and you'll see a real world, and that's not good for you. So thank you, Dave Lee, for coming on and showing us that Chatswood, this tiny little nowhere suburb in the middle of Nowheresville in Sydney, is actually the key to global geopolitics.
I honestly believe that it is a big danger to our country. And while we wind it up, this book is very important, The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury. I recommend it to you guys out there at home. Buy this book. This is the first one you should start with. If you're interested in the military strategy side of things, Hugh White he's an absolute expert in this field. This book was really good read. It was a really good read. I really enjoyed this book.
And I remember with the China choice, the sentences flow so beautifully.
It was such an amazing. Both those books are amazing. This is tough. It's not tough. It's just. This is another one on the list. This is probably the third in line, I would say. Clive Hamilton's Silent Invasion. If your viewers read anything this year, most important is the 100-Year Marathon. That's number one on the list, in order. Hugh White second, Silent Invasion third, because you can only get so much out of us talking online. you got to read the book. You need to understand what's going on in a little bit more depth, and then come back and get into the comments and let us know what you think.
Yeah, let's train these people up. Let's get some really good comments going and some really good thought processes, and get you know, if you want to do something positive, you know, get a sign and get out on the street. You know, it doesn't take that much effort. They do it all the time. Get out on the street. Start putting signs up. Put a little poster up every now and again. Write. You know, tell your friends. You know, by the way, did you know this is happening? Share these videos. Go to Dave's YouTube website. It's amazing. It's got all the best sort of information on how you're getting ripped off, like with your China tea thing and the labor, you know, how they undermine the wage rates and the fair employment processes. I mean, all of that stuff's happening to you there at home. You know, if you think you're not getting impacted, of course you're getting impacted. And it's all happening, so you have to really start to think about the future of what you want for yourself, your posterity, and others. You know, and wake up and read some books.
And you guys at home, if you're worried about saying something bad about the Chinese or the Chinese Communist Party, keep in mind you are a minority in your own country, and so therefore you're left wing. You're just asking for a fair go in your own country. Keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. You're not right wing. You're not alt right. You're not doing anything wrong. And if you don't speak up, your children will be living in poverty. Mark my words. Mark my words. Remember, you've been told. You've been warned.
Yeah, and thanks for the great thought experiment as well, the Sydney thought experiment. I thought it was a fantastic way to think about it. And thank you for Margot in the comments for flipping that on its head and talking about Beijing, because that really makes you think about the other alliance structure, which is really China on its own. I mean, they're losing North Korea to Trump, which is good on Trump for that. You know, but if you're like Dave here and you have, you know, the real inside information, there's a lot more going on in North Korea and in South Korea, which is a whole another 10-hour show.
Yeah, it's good to hear some people thinking about it in the comments. The Australia's slowly waking up bit by bit, and videos like this, they go a long way. They really do, and we need to spread the word and get the thoughts out there, because they're so important. Ideas change the world, and that's what we're trying to do here.
And thanks, Dr. Dan, and I'll talk to Dr. Dan as well. Thanks for being in the comments as well. I'll talk to Dr. Dan soon. We'll have him back on the show for more medical AI stuff. Again, I got to remind myself to try and get on you with Ben Goertzel, because Ben Goertzel's really, really cool. He's an awesome guy. And yeah, a whole bunch of other stuff. But yeah, all right. Thanks for coming on Detonation, Dave Lee. Always a pleasure. Can't wait till next time. I'm going to read some of these books and churn them out myself after the election, which is next weekend. Everyone's going to be there. It's going to be huge. It's going to be amazing. So after that, then I'm going to churn out some of these books, and we're going to come back and we're going to smash this. You know, so that'll be really good. So thank you so much, Dave, for coming on Detonation with me tonight.
Thanks for having me. See you guys in the next video.
Detonation, all more coming to you all this week.